Blindburn. The trouble with being middle-aged is that surprise has gone out of the world. Christmas is a repetition of things too familiar. The endless cycle of nature begins anew. Our hostess caught my eye nervously. Cleghorn, as a postprandial philosopher, was dangerous. His quiver of laboured unoriginality was evidently about to release at us over the port and claret. Perhaps, she said brightly, perhaps Professor Wishart would surprise us with a story. I had been primed for the invitation, should the need for it arise at the end of dinner. I fear most of my stories are rather long and uninteresting, I said. The polite murmur of dissent was marred only by the audible agreement of my wife several places along the table. However, I continued resolutely, there was once something, long ago now, which still worries me at times. It has the minor disadvantage of being true, which rather limits the imagination. But that apart, I have an idea there is a story in it somewhere, although I never made sense of it. Someone might say that the boundaries were adjusted for a moment. Then again, there's always the sceptic who laughs about flights of fancy. I could easily play the sceptic myself, but there would be no laughter. The company sat back, complacent in their captivity. Some of the weaker spirits evidently settling themselves, so that a sudden onset of sleep would not result in their toppling face first into the fruit and nuts. It was only years ago, I began, towards the end of December. I'd only been up at Oxford for a term, and with the enthusiasm of youth, I had somehow persuaded 3 other men from my college to come climbing during the vacation. The obligatory family Christmas had worked its way through turkey and paper hats, and squabbles with my father and elder sister, and with a sense of relief I boarded the overnight sleeper from Euston, on the evening of the 27th, I think it must have been. Relief was less to the fore when I got off the train at 8 the next morning. The platform of the desolate little station halfway between Perth and Inverness was still almost dark. A misty rain fell thickly. Beyond the station, a row of unlit cottages and a hotel, closed for the winter, straggled along a road which was to become the A9, but was then little more than a byway for local traffic that couldn't use the railway. The youth hostel we'd selected as our base camp could only be reached on foot. It stood alone, some 6 or 7 miles from the village and the nearest road, almost at the head of a narrow loch which lay to the northwest. However, the warden lived close to the station, and it was necessary to book in and collect the key at his cottage before proceeding, or so the SYHA handbook informed us. None of us had been there before. He was not pleased to see me. Wardens, he made it clear, were not paid to be disturbed at that hour. The drawn curtains and suggestion of stale whisky underscored his displeasure. I explained I had come off the Inverness train and was the first of the party, the other 3 being booked in to join me 2 nights later. He reluctantly opened the door into a small lobby. The yellowing wallpaper and tired rugs smelt faintly of damp wool and food. I signed the overnight book and paid him whatever it was, 2 shillings and 3pence, I think it was. The key, he said, was already at the hostel wi' 2 young laddies. He stamped my YHA card and was in the act of handing it back when he hesitated, staring at the passport photograph it contained. "That's a bonny likeness," he said, and then, "I don't think the like of yoursel have any directions for me." I explained I had never been there before and didn't know the district, despite having been born in Aberdeen. He looked up sharply at me with pale, rheumy eyes, and I felt he was about to say something about me or my name, but instead, after a pause, he just gave directions. "Go past the station, turn left over the old brig, follow the path across the heather by the electricity posts, and along the north shore of the loch. It's 6 mile. The other laddies are leaving tomorrow, so you'll be by yourself for the night. Have ye matches and a candle? Electricity isn't to be relied upon." I said I had matches, a torch, candles, and a primer stove, as well as plenty of provisions. "Weel, mind yoursel, and if you're in trouble in the dark, bide still till the dawn. The Blindburn's no a coothly place in the nicht, even for likes you can see." Then he added defiantly, "I want no rescue this season. If you need anything, Alan Wishart, you must come for it by day. The unexpected emphatic use of my name was a little intimidating, but it occurred to me that he did it with everyone to emphasize that he knew who was there if any damage was done. His old, pinched, unshaven face glowered after me in the dark of the winter dawn as I set out in the rain to look for the little peaty track to the loch. I was beginning to regret very much that the others would not be arriving until the 30th. But the die was cast, and I had cast it, and I had still to learn my limits. The hostel was not the usual shooting lodge or mansion abandoned for the use of the decently poor or strenuously healthy. It was a mean little stone cottage, with an open wooden porch, a door in the middle, and a single window either side. At the back, dark scree slopes climbed steeply into the low cloud that hung over everything. A small burn splashed past the side of the bothy and disappeared into stony turf some yards below. Hence, I presumed, Blindburn, the name on the Ordnance Survey map. In the foreground, 100 yards or so of nasty-looking peat hags lay between cottage and loch. As I approached the door, I saw the boots of the twa laddies tucked in under narrow benches on either side of the porch. Evidently, they were not scampering about on the high hills in the rain. Softies, I thought, with all the easy arrogance of an Oxford blue, although I had no more to my own credit than rowing once in the Christchurch regatta. The porch opened directly into a small common room with a trestle table and some kitchen chairs in the middle. A few orange boxes had been tacked together on one wall to perform the function of shelves, and a black stove stood at the rear of the room for cooking and heating. The only other room, dormitory is too grand a word, opened off to the right. It was slightly smaller and smelt of musty pine and varnish like an old Methodist chapel. In it were 4 bunks of regulation sparseness, narrow iron things with one berth above and one below. The SYHA handbook was very emphatic that there were sleeping places for only 8 males. Like the common room, the single window looked out to the front, across the peat hags to the loch. There was no running water, except the burn, and no other accommodation except for an unpleasant earth closet standing by itself behind the cottage. It had to be reached by going out of the front door, round the side, and then you were there. Fortunately, the young have elastic capacities. By the time I arrived, the rain had diminished to a drizzle, and I was thankful to find the stove lit and 2 long-boned youths sitting beside it. I never learnt their full names. They were just Len and Eric, decent fellows, despite their endless talk about football stars and skiffle groups. They seemed genuinely pleased to see me, and was openly curious about Oxford and my accent, as I was invincibly ignorant about Mansfield Town and theirs. I was glad of their company. But it was, I suppose, their company which set the scene for what I experienced after they had gone. I am, and have always been, untroubled by ordinary loneliness. Empty houses and silent hills do not bother me nearly as much as a cold bed or doubts about the quality of the next meal. But I was, and I hope I still am, sensitive to the moods of other people. And as the early twilight began to close in, I should perhaps say, we all had tried a walk earlier, but the low clouds made it dangerous and useless to do any climbing. As darkness fell, it was borne in on me that both boys, they might have been a couple of years younger than I was at the time, were nervous. I can only say they kept very close together and seemed peculiarly loath to let me out of their sight. They would come with me on some excuse if I went to the bedroom, or outside with me to look at the weather, and they talked too much. I don't mean like people who chatter and are happy, but more like those who talk eagerly and continuously to stop something being said or heard. I didn't have the sense to ask them what was the matter. Instead, I made things worse by deliberately and slightly mischievously playing up the situation. I brought the talk round to stories about empty houses and things that might have happened in hidden places. I wouldn't do it now. In the wrong situation, it can give some people a heightened alertness to sound and movement, which becomes genuinely frightening. One listens, and one hears. All very entertaining in a warm room in company after a good dinner. I caught my hostess's eye. But not so welcome when you are alone and there are only three of you, and empty darkness for many miles about. I turned in early, and they followed with sheep-like sociability, which ought to have been irritating but was somehow welcome. It seemed quite sensible that none of us should linger by the dying stove, but no reason was given or discussed. For a long while we lay talking, laughing nervously at a bunk that creaked somewhere, even when no one would admit to moving. I was the first in bed, but I believe the last to sleep, and my final impression, I may have been asleep already and partly awakened by the night, was of somebody moving about and crying. If I had been properly awake, I would have been embarrassed, and just possibly I'd have done something about it. As it was, I was too fuddled and cosy with sleep to be pulled back into consciousness. But if I thought at all, I must have presumed it was one of the boys. But in the morning, I remembered it more like a dream than something heard. I didn't say anything. The morning was bitterly cold. A hard frost, clear skies, and a dry northeast wind had replaced the Atlantic fret of the previous day. For a while, I lay inside my sleeping bag, fortified by several layers of thin youth hostel blankets, which would have been more equally at home, or even more at home, in a police cell or a mortuary. I tried in vain to shrink into the ever-retreating pool of warmth somewhere in the middle of the bunk. I think the others were doing the same. In the end, we flapped out of bed like rocketing pheasants and dressed with furious speed. The boys were leaving that morning, and we walked the long path back to Badenoch station together. They to catch the midday train south, I to fetch half a hundredweight of coke from the yard at the station. I couldn't carry it now to save my life, but then it seemed a small price to pay for warmth and for light, although I was not thinking of that at the time. As they left, they were both full of cheerful banter about the prospects of me coming home alone. It was suddenly at the tip of my tongue to ask if they had heard anything unusual the previous night, but the moment passed. A man of 21 is more afraid of stumbling on another's tears than he is of physical injury. But as the train started to move, Eric rather deliberately called me from their compartment windows, as if he had been saving it until I couldn't question him further. His voice and the sight of him would disappear in a cloud of steam and engine smoke as the train pulled into a cutting beyond the deserted platform. He called, "Don't worry, there's nothing there," or something like that. I returned slowly along the shores of the loch, reluctantly aware that I did not want to be alone that night. The darkness came on quickly, despite the clear skies, and the soggy turf near the bothy was crisp with the onset of frost by the time I got back. I lit the stove with dry heather and tried to make the place cosy, but without success. The piteous supply of electricity which hobbled up from the village along a row of rickety poles, which I had followed twice that day, was only sufficient for a comfortless glow in the middle of the common room, and the same in the dormitory. Even the candle on the table gave a better light for reading. I looked out at about 7 o'clock. It was very still and less cold. The sky must have been overcast, for I could see no stars. The only sound was the faraway roar of wind and the falling water in the mountains, and the more distinct splashing of the Blindburn near at hand. It felt like snow, which had not been forecast when I spoke to the man at the station coal yard, and snow carried with it the worry that I might be isolated from the friends who were to arrive at Badenoch the next day. I shut the door, but apparently not properly, because it began to rattle against the worn snib as a thin wind picked up while I was cooking supper. It was then that I discovered the key was missing. No one could be there to lock out, but the unlocked door gave an unpleasant sense of insecurity. I jammed the rucksack against it in a first attempt to get some peace. and although it stopped the movement at that point, gave no feeling of safety. As I sat there later in the evening, at the behest of my distant tutor, trying to concentrate on some new, now forgotten economic text, I was continually diverted by sounds in the bothy which eluded my hearing when I tried to attend to them, and movements, perhaps they were shadows from the candle, which I could never quite catch with the eye. I was not exactly frightened, but I was beginning to dread the thought of moving into the unlit room with the empty bunks, where I would not be able to see. And I would lose control of the common room with its door to things outside. Imagination, I told myself. Imagination fortified by being alone. But telling yourself doesn't help. Then a new draft started to rattle the dormitory door, at first almost imperceptibly, and then more persistently. In a flurry of noisy movement, I flung it open, dragged one of the bunks into the common room, closed the door again, and stuck the back of a chair under the handle, all the time feeling the fool that I was, for no one could have been in the other room, and nothing could have threatened me from it. I made up the stove with ruthless disregard for the fuel supply before securing the window. It was supposed to be covered by a mean little pull-down blind. Goodness knows why they bothered out there. But the blind stuck halfway, and fixing one of the blankets across the recess of the window was the only thing that gave some relief from the feeling that one could be seen without seeing. Heavy snowflakes swirled past, scratching like soft fingernails at the glass. I sat down and tried again to read, but concentration was impossible. I was still trying to hear something distinct from the background swish of snow and wind and water. I paced around the room. I made up the stove even more generously and sat with my back to it, but it was no good. Some sharpness of the senses or some unnatural alertness had let loose things which could not be brought under control. It was 10 o'clock. I kicked off my shoes, got into the sleeping bag on the top bunk, more or less still dressed, and pulled the blankets up to my chin. I ought to have been hot. I got colder. The low-voltage bulb burning dimly in the brown ceiling, and the length of candle remained lit on the table. You see, all my reason and understanding and boyish strength said I was alone and safe, but my senses told me I was not, and yet they told me nothing I could get hold of. The hot orange glow from the stove was an ally. The wind and cold were not. For a long time, I remained awake and acutely alert, afraid not to listen, and afraid that by listening I would indeed hear something. All the while, I lay on my back in order to see as much of the room as possible. Nature is, however, very strong, and my body was tired by the 6-mile haul back from the village with the coke. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. An overactive attention to one's surroundings cannot be indefinitely prolonged when there is nothing to focus upon. There was an interval of time, more pronounced than on the first night, of which I was not conscious. Out of it, I emerged slowly from the insistent pricking of acute cold. I shrank into myself, but the cold followed, like snow blowing into a rabbit's burrow. I opened my eyes to darkness. The electric light had gone, but the warden had warned that it could fail. There was no candle. It must have burnt out. I rolled my eyes sideways. There was no light from the stove. It was not merely dark. There was only void and icy space with something terrible moving in it. It may now sound absurd, but my immediate paralyzing fear was not the thing in the room with me, but that I had gone blind, blackened out from the world by some sudden and appalling physical stroke. I absolutely knew the terror of being sightless. Then, out in the darkness, came a distinct sound. The door latch rattled. Something or someone was at the door. The latch rattled again, followed by the perfectly audible clash of the door shutting. It was impossible. No one could be there or go out at such a night. No one could have come up from Badenoch in the dark of the snowstorm. But as in a dream, I believed. What broke the spell was feeling the hard lump of the torch under the coat I was using as a pillow. I fumbled for it. Light. Please, gods, let there be light. The beam cut across the room. Both doors were shut as I had left them. The candle was reduced to a pool in its own wax. Nothing had been moved. I fell out of the bunk. The place was empty. But in my confusion, I thought that some poor wretch had gone out into the cold. I could hear crying, something human beyond the howling of the storm. My rucksack was still wedged against the door. I tore it away. The door instantly blew tight against the snib. When I opened it, snowflakes flew in like a cloud of white dancing flies in the torchlight. Someone was crying. I had no doubt of it now. The noise was receding into darkness, and as I stood there hesitating, it was gone. I shouted. I called. I put on my boots to go out and search. I waved my torch and called. But some practical spark of sanity, or perhaps it was the words of the warden or the boy in the departing train, said that it was not real, not now, as I too would be lost forever in the cold if I followed. The door banged. I felt for the latch, really blinded by the snow this time. As I barred the door again with my rucksack, my feeling was no longer of panic terror, but of I knew not what, an entirely inexplicable pity and sadness for the lost one who had stumbled out into the darkness that would never be lighted again, or filled with the warmth of human company. I cannot understand what happened. Fear was replaced with compassion. It was very strange. There is a little more to tell. The candle was easily relighted after the wax had been scraped away to release the wick. The rest of the night was wearisome, but nothing more. I drank coffee, wrapped up in all the blankets I could find, and sat at the table waiting for the dawn. The next day, the others succeeded in battling up from the station through quite deep drifts. They had seen the electricity posts down in one place. There was, of course, no trace of anyone outside the bothy when I was able to look. Not that I really expected it to be. I said nothing about my experience to my friends, and it was perfectly obvious they sensed nothing strange about the place at any time. Neither did I. The moment, whatever it was, had passed, and what remained was empty and ordinary. But I still retain the almost entirely irrational conviction that when I woke I was blind, and that I could not have seen in those first moments had there been light to see, and that in that blindness I somehow shared an experience with another human being, for whom I felt first fear, then pity. I say almost entirely irrational conviction, because when I looked at the stove after giving up my attempt at an exploration outside, it was still shedding its warm orange light on floor and ceiling. It had never been out, and there was no possibility of not seeing this from my position in the bunk. I put the matter to the test the very night. That's all. I sat back from the table, aware that the narrative had not gone as well as I had hoped. Truth is usually less exciting than fiction. Giles was noisily asleep. Elizabeth Farmiloe was gallantly propping up half-shut eyelids. I glanced apprehensively at the other guests. Either my story or the claret had taken its toll. Then I saw Cleghorn. He was wide awake and staring at me as if I had jumped fully formed out of a Christmas cracker. His vast jaw, which always seemed to be winched up and down several times before he began to speak, gave warning of impending judgment. I steeled myself for a sermon. "And you mean you have lived all these years without having the spirit to ask what it meant?" he said. "I don't know what you think I should have done," I replied rather stiffly. Youth hostels don't exactly encourage psychical research or metaphysical speculation, and I have never been back. Why, man, you could have told the warden. Well, there would have been no point. Anyway, have you ever tried revealing your private imaginings to a cantankerous, hungover Scotsman on the 2nd of January? Yes, I have, he said harshly. The warden was my father. And because you were too timid to ask or tell, he went to his grave, God rest his soul, ignorant of what had been put an end to the wandering spirit of poor Jeanie Wishart. It was my turn to stare at him, voiceless on the instant, with embarrassment and surprise. But our hostess, evidently wishing to pour oil on troubled waters, interrupted. Perhaps, Alan, she said, Dr. Cleghorn can add to your story. I'm sure he could explain before you're welcome in the new year. For a moment or two, Cleghorn held back, and I had leisure to wish fervently that I had put things differently in describing the warden. But how could I have anticipated such a coincidence? Then his jaw began to work again. I do not know that I should satisfy your curiosity, he began. But since the hand of God has brought us together, and since you have inadvertently belittled my father's name, I think for his sake you should know the truth. Before the cottage was a hostel, when my father was a small boy, it had been for years the home of one Jeanie Wishart. Yea, Wishart was the name. Are you surprised, Alan, that he was struck by your name turning up so aptly at the anniversary? She was old and frail, but she must have known every stick and stone about the place, and somehow lived out there by herself, as the very old may live in a place they know well, though they will die if you move them. Then came the great storm. It may have been the snow that confused her. At any rate, when the young men from Badenoch got through some days later in the new year, they found her body in the snow, a few yards beyond the door. She was dressed in nothing but a shift. The door was latched behind her. They brought her body back and is buried in the kirkyard here. Cleghorn paused. Someone murmured, Go on. Well, the cottage lay empty for years and years. And then along came the new hikers, and it was patched up as a hostel. Gradually, stories began to be told. Odd stories about young climbers who would never go back there, or robust men who would up and depart at most extraordinary hours. Then suddenly it all stopped, about the time you were there, Alan, and the cottage became as normal as a postbox. He turned to our hostess. You will draw your own conclusions, he said, but it's a most extraordinary thing. And then to me, there are more things in heaven and earth than I dreamed of in your philosophy, Alan. Perhaps your compassion for the poor soul released her, for I am sure now you are the last of the many who heard her going out. And for that kindness, I forgive you your inadvertent hard words about my father. You see, he cared about her very much. My grandfather, but that's an old story, nothing to the purpose. He smiled at me, that kind smile that was more healing than all his medicines. He did drink more than was good for him when he was old. Maybe it's the best way. His face became serious again. But it is an extraordinary thing. You see, for many years before her death, Jeanie Wishart was completely blind.